everyone. Welcome back to the Welcome Table with Sydney.
And Tatum.
And today we're going to be joined by the Professor Michele Goodwin. Professor Michele Goodwin is the Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine. She also is a recipient of the 2020-2021 Distinguished Senior Faculty Award for Research, the highest honor that can be awarded by the UC Irvine. So she is also the first law professor at the University of California, Irvine to receive this award. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute as well as an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the Hastings Center. So she has a whole bunch of accolades and awards, and we're so excited to be talking with her today. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. And before we get started on our questions, because we're so excited to learn more about you, we do a little show and tell before, and we will go first this week. So this week I brought this little photo book that my mom made for us, for my siblings and I when we were kids. It's called Laguna Beach Summer '09.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah, so my mom was very, very sweet. She worked full time, but she always made sure to take us out places and to make memories and take a lot of photos. And she would make us these little photo books of our experiences. Yeah, that's me.
Wow.
Me in the wild. Yeah, and she would always make us feel special and create these little photo books of our special days, which were usually on Sundays because those were her days off. And yeah, we have all these cool little memories because
that is cool.
We took time out to go to CVS and make these little photo books.
That is sweet. That's what moms do. Exactly. And they're often not in the pictures because they're taking the pictures.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, and this is a moment where I felt like the belle of the beach.
Look at that. You look like a little mermaid. Yes.
I felt so cool in this moment. So yeah, I just wanted
that's so neat, and what that does in terms of energy, self-esteem, right? As you were saying, just how good you felt in that moment. Like you were it. Your mom helped you to capture that feeling of feeling it, under the Laguna Beach sunlight on the sand. What a beautiful memory, and something that you'll be able to carry on with you for all of your days and to share it like you've just done today. That's terrific.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a keepsake, and I'm just excited to be able to share it with my own family one day. So yeah,
it's so sweet. I love that.
So special in that way. They think of everything. So
that's true. And I thought about a number of things. So I'll tell you about what I thought about. So I thought about an image of a person who was just she was more than a best friend. She was really my sister, and she passed away from breast cancer. And these are times of grief for a lot of people. And when she passed away, this was some years ago, but it took me 5 years to be able to actually say her name without welling up a little bit. And so, just in thinking about how people are processing things through pandemic, through grief, and through loss, I see that. And the other thing that I thought about, and this resonates with what you just showed, was a picture of me and my daughter from a birthday that I had. And we had just such a lovely day together in West Hollywood, capped off with a wonderful evening of music. So I thought about showing that. But then what I landed on, so the image that I'm sharing with you right here, which I hope you'll be able to see, this is a picture that was taken August 5th, 1864. This was 1 year before the abolition of slavery in the United States with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And it's an image of people picking cotton, Black people picking cotton in the United States. And it's something that's important for us to remember, in that we're not far off from that time, and we're not far off from the legacy of that time and what it means when there is centuries of people laboring without pay for their labor, and then also being relegated to the status of chattel, right? So it's not just low wages or no wages, but it is also people saying that you are not human. And when people are saying you're not human, you have no rights even to your own bodily autonomy, or that of your children, or that of your loved ones. You have no control when someone says, now I think I just want to sell your child.
Right. Exactly.
No, I think I just want to leash your child away.
Mhm.
No, I just want to like sell you and take you away from your children. Or when people say, and this was common during the antebellum period, these are not your children. Yes, you may have birthed them, but we own them, and chattel cannot have children, right? So it's important that we understand those legacies and that this was not immediately resolved right after the end of slavery. Instead, we moved into a period of Jim Crow, which is a horrific and challenging period. And we haven't even gotten to that with all of the controversy and challenge over recognizing American slavery in the 1619 Project. We haven't even gotten to the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah.
So, anyway, so thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for our show and tell.
Of
Yeah,
course, yeah.
awesome.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
showing that. It's it's a very stark reminder that we again are not that far away from that time period and the implications and real life consequences of what that period did to Black people in America. So
Yeah.
100%. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful way to start off the interview.
Okay.
So we're just going to be deep diving into you and your work.
Okay.
So first things first, your research. We came up with a fun question because there's so many questions we could ask you. So we just wanted you to describe your field of work in 3 words, if you could. What's the best way to describe it and why?
Deep.
Deep, okay.
Informative.
Deep, informative.
Contemplative.
Okay, okay. And then why would you choose those 3 words?
Just like the image that I showed, we scratch at the surface of our of our history in the United States. We only scratch. We don't do deep dive. We've not reached that point of being able to confront honestly, dispassionately, that kind of space. And so my work challenges us to go deeper, to think about matters of sex and race and socioeconomics, inclusion and belonging. What does the Constitution mean in the lives of people who've been dispossessed of even being possessed of their bodies? What does the Constitution mean when equality for all was not something that was realized until after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, even though what was written in the Constitution spoke of equality? But in reality, to really get us there, it wasn't the founding fathers, wasn't the forefathers, or it wasn't, right? I mean, this was on the backs of people in Alabama, Black people in Alabama and Mississippi, whatnot, protesting at lunch counters, protesting so that they could ride buses in ways that afforded them dignity, so that they could vote, so that they could be educated, all of these kinds of things, and suffering grave costs for it, including young people. As I think about Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 3 young people in their early 20s who went to Mississippi. One of them was already from Mississippi, Cheney, and who died in their effort to just tell Black people you can vote and here's how, right? And so deep is that, sort of my opportunity as a professor to profess and to get us to think in deep ways. Informative, I think that I use that one. And so informative, which is to go through the archives of who we are and to inform. And for us to all come together and inform. And there's a value for thinking about our past, understanding them for what they are, and in fact, our current times. To inform is critically important in an open way, and to be open to dialogue. It's critically important. And that straddles both my work in law and also in medicine. And then contemplative, which means that really want and strive for people to contemplate then what these histories mean. What does it mean when we go deep, we unearth facts, and now we have to, look at these and figure out, all right, what does this mean? What does it mean in terms of who the people were, all the stakeholders, right? So you sort of think about, what does this mean if we were to sort of think about an archive of the 1600s, the 1700s, et cetera? And what does it mean how we relate to it today? How do we contemplate something like COVID-19 with the backdrop of history? Because COVID reveals underlying institutional and infrastructural inequalities in our society. How do we contemplate that then going forward when we want people to be vaccinated? How do we contemplate who are the people that get vaccinated and don't get vaccinated and why? And so much more. I could go on just about those three words. I'll stop there.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think those are very succinct ways of describing something so complicated and layered, obviously. So that provided a lot of context as to how you view your field and what the reality of it is. And we'd like to get to know more about it, actually. So you are credited with helping to establish and shape the health law field. You directed the first ABA accredited health law program in the nation and established the first law center focused on race and bioethics.
Amazing.
Yeah. You also rank as one of the most cited professors ever, which is very impressive. And we wanted to know, what are some of the challenges that accompany such a position of influence? You know, because that's a lot of responsibility.
Well, thank you for asking that question. And again, sometimes we're driven by the things that have occurred to us. So, for example, there are people who start off their lives saying that they want to become a doctor because someone in their family suffered through an illness and perhaps even died from that illness. And so they want to pursue medicine. Or some people want to pursue law because there's a concern about social justice. My work at the intersection of these fields has a lot to do with my own experiences, and there are varieties of them that lead me to this space. But you've asked about responsibility. Well, it's a great question because there's the forward face, which is wonderful, being able to engage with colleagues, with students, with researchers, with policymakers. And my work takes me all around the world doing that. But yes, there are costs when you're pioneering. I remember when I was in law school and being interviewed at a law firm, and there was a partner. She may have been the only woman partner at this big law firm, or one of a very few. And she said, "Well, you join us and you can be a pioneer." And I thought about this, and I thought, really, in the 1990s, women are still having to talk about being pioneers in these spaces. And when you are pioneering, yes, there are costs because there are things that people haven't thought about before, and you're bringing a new lens. And sometimes you're like, well, how can that possibly be? Because John and Jack and toss in another guy named Eric haven't thought about this before. So if they haven't thought about it and they haven't written about it, what are you doing talking about it? Is it legitimate? And this is actually something that a number of women experience in the academy across myriad areas where their innovations are challenged, whereas when men have innovative ideas, it's considered innovative. Even if there are ideas that will fail, that is okay. It's considered a good thing. Wow, wasn't that courageous? Isn't he a risk taker? Isn't that wonderful that he's bringing ideas to the table and bringing people along with those ideas? And for women over time, as women have tried to do that, they're just empirically, we know there just simply hasn't been that reception, right? So empirically, we know that there were limits and quotas on women's admission into colleges and universities and medical schools and law schools and schools of dentistry. And still in STEM, we see those barriers. And so things are much better now when one thinks about the number of people who are enrolled. But when you think about what comes after enrollment, right, when you're sort of in the profession, then that's where there are challenges that can occur. But with challenges, there are also opportunities. And so let me speak to some of those that are specifically, right? Like, so you say, okay, well, what do you confront when you're, at the forefront of something? Well, you may confront, does your work get published or not, if you're a woman? I'm fortunate and I, write, and I've been able to be successful in publishing, at many of the most elite law journals and books with elite presses and whatnot, but that takes work. And it also means bringing other people along, because if I'm able to do it, I want other people to be able to do it and to help people be able to do it. But that also involves then convincing others that yes, these women of color are qualified and have the same qualifications or better than the guys who've come along. This also means with hiring, I've been successful in terms of where I've been able to do my work, and people have sought me to join their institutions. But it's also meant doing the work of, again, bringing other people along and saying, well, these women deserve opportunities too. These are smart women of color. These are people that we should want to have in the spaces that we're in. And I would say, as a final component, though, really, we could kind of check lots of boxes, which is that in a society now where it's so much easier to gain access to people, one thing is that it's positive. We get together and people get to see this show and to hear it. And at the same time, we're a society where people have really leaned into bullying, where they have leaned into tracking women of color who are in various professions, into threatening them. And so I suppose I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there are women of color who are teaching and putting a bright smile on what it is that they do, and sometimes they get threatening emails. Sometimes, they sort of get attacked and hate and threats on their lives and things like that, just simply because they're writing about what they write about, simply because they're educating their students. And I think that that's something that many people don't appreciate, that their colleagues simply don't experience.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for sharing all of that with us. I think that oftentimes we don't get to see the back layer of some of the things that people in positions of power, influence, like experience, but it was very informative, and thank you for just opening up to us about that.
Yeah.
You are welcome.
Thank you. And then our next question would be like, who influences you? You're so, I don't know, you're just so magnetic, and the things that you talk about, I can really like hear your passion. So like, what drove your passion? We're curious.
Well, that's great. So I would say that one, my grandparents. So this may sound corny, but my first few years were spent growing up with grandparents, and one set of grandparents were from the American South, and it was wonderful. I mean, I had a grandmother who baked wonderful cakes and pies and great food. But at the same time, she was a real community leader and organizer. She kind of ran her own underground railroad in a way, because she opened her doors to many families, many women who were still migrating north from the American South, getting away from Jim Crow America. And there were many people that I only knew as aunts, Aunt Bernice, Aunt fill in the blank, who, as it turned out later, had no biological relation to us. But my grandmother wanted to accord them dignity, family. And as these people came and they stayed with us, it's such an inspiration for me. And the other, grandparents took me to the ballet, to opera, to things like that, shopping on weekends. And so so that was wonderful. But I'm also a reader. So that was the familial part. But I'm a reader, and I have to say that I love James Baldwin.
Oh, yes.
That's our guy.
That is the king.
Right? That is the magic, right? And when I was in my youth living in Italy, reading James Baldwin, it just resonated so deeply in understanding Black Americans in our own diaspora, right? To find places of freedom where we can think and be with dignity. Toni Morrison as well, what a wonderful influence. But let me say, I also give a shout out as well to figures that we may not think about, right? I'm incredibly moved by people whose names I will never know, that I've seen on images being arrested in the 1940s and 50s, as they're just simply standing up for rights that would ultimately mean something meaningful for everyone in our society. Those voiceless, nameless people. Of course, they had names. I just won't know their names. We know Congressman John Lewis, and there's certain figures that we can, put out on a board. But that's really inspirational to me too. And I just have a very long list of friends who lifted me up. I'll give out two. So if your audience wants to read a really terrific academic, Dorothy Roberts, she's just been such a great friend. She wrote the book Killing the Black Body. I remember the day that I saw that book on a shelf and picked it out of the shelf and sat down reading it. Really, really powerful. And another really good friend who's been a wonderful, kind of stand by the side is Lori Andrews. And so anyway, lots of inspiration from lots of different places. I'm inspired right now just by seeing you two on the screen.
Oh,
Thank you.
no, thank you. That's wonderful, to acknowledge like the big, the heavy hitters, but also to acknowledge those who you'll never know either, like as I hear you speak, I'm thinking of my own dad who was a part of the Great Migration, like you were talking about. He moved from the South to the North in California and was able to start his life out here. And just to think that he was a part of that. He's 83, so he's like an older person. So he's seen it all. So just to think about that is it's just very moving, just the gravity of that existence and everybody's existence who contributed to, where we have all arrived now, like you were saying. Yeah.
That's right. That's powerful to just think that, living amongst us are generations of people who had no electricity, no running water, not because they chose, I'm going to have a camper lifestyle. Right. I'm going to get in my Volkswagen, van and just kind of go around, and camp and hike. No, it's because of government denial.
Right. Yeah.
Of services, of accommodations, because of laws that ban Black people in some states from even playing checkers in public. Like, you have to think about, this is a legislature that one is supposed to respect and give deference to when you spent your time thinking about, okay, let's make sure that Black people can't play checkers in public, that they can't bowl, that they can't play billiards. I mean, who actually makes these things into law? And the sad part is that we don't yet recognize, and we need to. Here's the laundry list. Like, let's be clear. This is the level to which we sought, even after slavery was over, to control the destinies of Black people.
That's really, really important. I don't think that, even me, I don't think that I sit down and like ponder that as often as I wish that I could, because again, like the checkers and the bowling, I didn't know about the checkers, but I knew about the bowling. And so it's just, I don't know, like to see how far we have come and then to see how far we have to go is just very surreal experience as a Black person in America.
Well, and let me also give a shout out to Pauli Murray, Dr. Pauli Murray. I mean, again, an unsung hero. She was pre-Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg later talked about what she learned from Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray was a queer Black woman extraordinaire who in the 1940s was already writing about things that would not become law for decades forward with regard to sex equality, race equality, laying down the blueprint. Many people don't even know, laying down the foundational legal arguments for gender and sex equality, which later Ruth Bader Ginsburg would be recognized for, but it's Pauli Murray's work. Pauli Murray is at the ACLU as a board member before Ruth Bader Ginsburg is even hired by the ACLU. She lays the blueprint, you won't even believe this, but it's true, lays the blueprint for what would become Brown v. Board of Education and the strategies for the civil rights movement while she is in law school. And she is at Howard Law School and she writes these papers that are then used by her professors. And, because the professors at Howard were deeply involved in those cases. And so shout out to Pauli Murray for one last reason too, which is that when we think about these laws, she cataloged them. And she cataloged them in a book called Race Laws. And this book is nearly 800 pages long, single space, all of these race laws. And Thurgood Marshall called it the Bible of the civil rights movement. So I commend your audience to take a look at it. We shall all have it on our shelves as a point of memory.
Well, thank you. I mean, Tatum and I will be moving in. We're going to USC for grad school. So when we move to our house in LA,
Exciting.
it will be a book that we will be purchasing.
Yes, that is on the list.
That's exciting.
Thank you so much.
I mean, in the conversation, like you just steered us right into our next question about the justice system and like recognizing Black and brown folks. Why is it important to question and revise the current institutions within the justice system, as we just,
Yes. Well, there are many reasons why that's critically important. And let me say that, we can start with the fact that the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world by a long margin. And with this incarceration, it not only impacts the lives of men, but it also impacts the lives of women as well. The United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. And the majority of these women are mothers, and overwhelmingly, they are non-violent offenders. And, when we just think about that, and that's in these contemporary times, it's sad. My work takes me around the world, and when I've done work on sex trafficking, let's say in the Philippines, I remember once I was interviewing the head of an NGO, and this is a non-governmental nonprofit organization, and she was working on behalf of girls who had been sex trafficked. And she shared with me that as part of her punishment for being a political dissident, her children were incarcerated with her. Like, we're going to punish them too. And I thought, how horrific, how terrible is that? Well, in the United States now, we incarcerate so many women that for good behavior, they get to have their kids in jail with them. And you think about that, right? I mean, yes, this is wonderful that the kids can stay with their moms. But why should these women be incarcerated anyway? And what does it mean when a child grows up behind barbed wire, machine guns, and so forth? And so, these kinds of travesties are part of our justice system, which is really an injustice system. And that doesn't even scratch the surface at the ways in which there is disparate surveillance, disparate policing, disparate arrests, disparate charging. And if we had time, we could go through each one of those areas and I could show you the ways in which it's disparate and then how that creates its own social narrative. But let me just give you an example. I was not long ago on a panel, and on this panel were people who write and talk in these areas. And one of the panelists, a professor, said, well, it really is a tragedy what happens in terms of Black and brown incarceration. And he said, but, what we have to stress is the fact that Black and brown people commit more crimes. And I said, wait, hold it, because that's not true. It's not. It is not. Black and brown people do not commit more crime. They do not. It's that they are policed more. They are surveilled more. They are arrested more. And I gave the example, the following, which is that between every Thursday and Monday, if we wanted to find out where lots of crime is taking place, lots of drug use, underage drinking, trafficking of drugs, go to America's college campuses. We don't police inside the campuses, nor should we. But you can notice that there is a racialized difference in terms of how we talk about this. If we're policing on the outside and we say, oh, but look at those Black and brown kids and that marijuana and those drugs, see, we policed and we arrested them, but go inside the gates. If this is really what we want to do, right, to be empirical and see who's doing it, open up the gates of Yale, open up the gates of Harvard, open up the gates of Stanford, open up the gates of the UC system, and then we'll see who's using marijuana. We'll see who's drinking underage. We'll see who's giving their friends all myriad forms of drugs. Now, I don't believe we should engage in that kind of policing, but given the way in which we police, it creates a very false narrative. And today it surfaces in the following, which is that there are people who are serving 10, 20, 30-year life sentences because they had marijuana, or because they had some residue of marijuana and a smoking paraphernalia, and they're Black and brown. And at that same backdrop, we have young people of means who've opened up dispensaries where they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we say, isn't this great? But they happen to be white.
Yeah.
And one can't help but stare that in its face and to say, okay, we need to reconcile this.
Mhm.
We need to be more contemplative about what this means. We need to go deeper and we need more information about this.
Yeah, I mean, when you say that, especially that last part, it kind of reminds me of when you mentioned, you know, Black people, brown people, they didn't have the option of van life, you know, that was just survival. And it's the same with, you know, with drugs, with, you know, marijuana, with drug trading, all this stuff. It was a means of survival because there were no better options. But for it to be a trend now, for it to be monetized legally in the faces of all of these people who are incarcerated, you know, due to this like very strategic policing, you know, it's
Yes.
it's
You know, and one real concern for me is so in 2010, we saw the passage of the Affordable Care Act. People call it the, what is it? The Obamacare, Obama bill, et cetera. Right. But it was intended to address the fact that we have tens of millions of Americans who have no health insurance, right? Tens of millions of Americans. And that there are Americans that are going bankrupt trying to pay for medical bills. Now, the reason that I bring this up is exactly for the point that you just raised, which is that what we know and what we've seen from the opioid crisis is that if you have a doctor and you have insurance, doctors are taking care of your pain, your psychological pain, your emotional pain, your physical pain, all of that. And of course, we saw through the opioid crisis also engaged in behaviors that were unethical and in some cases illegal. But my point being is that when we look at drug use as, oh, look at those people, when meanwhile, if we were to look at drugs as a whole, because these drugs are not different. Sort of like, well, these drugs on the street, they're different. They're really not. But if we look at drugs as a whole, then we'd say, oh, it turns out doctors have been prescribing a whole lot to populations that have insurance. So then it's legitimate if you happen to be in a certain zip code, you happen to look a certain way, then it's legitimate to address your pain, your stress, your aches, like backache, let's give you a prescription.
right.
Feet ache, give you a prescription. Headache, here's a prescription. Whether people think we prescribe too much or not, but the point is this sort of human cost of pain and suffering is real. On the other hand, to your point, if you have no insurance, if you are poor, maybe you too still have backache. Maybe you too still have headache, and maybe you have these other things, right? Um, and for many of those people, being dispossessed of systems actually have turned to street level pharmaceutical, right? And again, these are holistic things that we want to address. I don't want anybody to conflate this and say, well, Professor Goodwin is saying go on the streets and get your drugs. That's not what I'm saying.
No.
But I am saying this, that when we treat one woman who is poor, who says, I can't take it anymore, my back hurt, my feet hurt, my head hurts, and I went to the street and I got marijuana or whatever she got, and she's arrested and sentenced to a heavy time in jail, and her kids are taken away from her. And on the other hand, a woman who goes and to her physician, and the physician treats her with sympathy, empathy, and care, and says, here, let me give you something to ease your pain. And society says, isn't that so good? Isn't that so wonderful how she was treated with care and dignity? And I ask, what's the difference between these two women?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and then to that point, that kind of leads into our next question in the same vein of just evaluating inequity within this system. So you have a podcast with Miss Magazine. It is called On the Issues with Michele Goodwin, which is amazing. So you spoke with Dr. Cherie Dawson Edwards on episode 34 of this podcast, and you discussed Breonna Taylor. You discussed what her legacy means to the Black Lives Matter movement, and also what it means in terms of how we treat Black and brown women within the system of policing and just in the world in general. And we wanted to ask, you mentioned an interesting point during the interview in which you said that you asked who is writing history. You asked, why is it important to evaluate who's writing history? And we want to ask you directly, why did you bring that up? Why is that question important when we think about how we move forward and how we evaluate the past?
It's well, thank you first of all, I'm so impressed by both of you, and so appreciative to be on your show, to get you on my show. Okay, when I go on vacation, I know who needs to fill in for me. But there's a saying, and the saying is, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until the lion has its say, or the lioness has its say, right? So when we sort of think about how things went down, right, the hunter is always going to talk about, oh, here's what I had to do, and I came out a champion. And the idea behind it is that, well, that will always be the story until, right, the person that's hunted gets to tell their story about that hunt. And so who gets to write history really matters in terms of what lens we get to place on any particular issue. I'll give you an example. For my first book, which was Black Markets, and Black Markets dealt with matters of the human body in traffic, most specifically about organ transplantation, but also about who gets access to organ transplantation and who doesn't, and what are the kind of nuanced systems in between. Well, anyway, as part of that research, this is how I first learned about Dr. Marion Sims decades ago. Dr. Sims experimented on the bodies of enslaved Black women. He kept them at the back of his house. He would rouse them in the middle of the night. He would cut into their uteri, their abdomen. He would deny them anesthesia. Sometimes he would have other doctors watch him as he did this. He wrote in his autobiography about how he would have, as he described it, epiphanies in the middle of the night. And so at midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, he would get them up so that he could experiment on them. Well, he wrote all of this in his autobiography. And the point that I bring to your show is that he was lauded and celebrated as the grandfather, the father of gynecology. There was a statue of him put in Central Park, though he is not from New York. It's a big deal to get a statue in Central Park. It's recently been taken down, but there were other statues of him put up. And as I read his autobiography, though, I was horrified. Seeing that, like, here are all these people who, for decades or more than a century, read Marion Sims' autobiography and thought, this is brilliant.
Yeah,
I read it and I saw torture.
Mm-hmm.
I saw abuses. I saw inhumanity. And it does matter who reads the story. Because if you're talking about medical schools that primarily excluded women, definitely excluded Black people, male and female, then we're talking about legacies of white men who came to those stories and who thought that made sense enough to rally around him, hold him up as a leader in the field, someone to be revered and not someone to address in terms of the complications of his history. And so as I read it, and then as more women read it and more women of color read it, it then became a very different narrative. And now his statue is removed from Central Park.
Thank goodness, because you bring up an excellent point. It really does matter. Your life experience, it completely plays into the way you perceive the world around you. And that's a conversation that we talk about often in our welcome table interviews. But with that point specifically, it's like, wow, you have someone who was literally torturing women, who has a whole statue in New York. And I just, it boggles my mind that only like the statue was taken down. Like, when was it taken down? Probably.
This was just a couple of years ago. And
Yeah.
you know what's interesting is that this was not like CSI detective story. This is his own words, right? Like this isn't
published, yeah.
Right? I mean, this isn't where someone has to debate it and say, well, we're not sure if it's true. This is what people are assuming. This is what he wrote in his own autobiography.
Yeah.
So we don't have to, debate those facts. Those facts exist. And now what are we going to do about it?
Exactly. Right.
Well, thank you for bringing up that point. You're just you have so many good ideas, and like I'm just pondering all of them in my head. But I just thank you for sharing that example. On the subject of changes, we also wanted to ask about in an article for Miss Magazine entitled "Addressing Racism's Toll: My Minneapolis Experience." You talked about your experience with George Floyd and reflecting on your personal experience with racism, and we found that article very interesting. And we actually pulled a quote. So you said, "We all want a more just society, not only for ourselves, but also for our children. And to achieve this, improving and protecting our democracy must be at the root of our efforts." And we loved that. And it played into kind of what we expect to see in the future in terms of change. So seeing that it has been a year since the passing of George Floyd's murder, many, including yourself, have called for more forward action. Have you observed any notable changes in the way that we approach the topic of racism and police brutality?
Well, one really needs to acknowledge the hard work on the ground of young people and older people and everybody in between. And there have been advancements, right? So in Louisville now there are these no-knock warrants gone. In Brooklyn Center, where Dante Wright was shot and killed just a few weeks ago during the trial of Derek Chauvin. They've recently passed a resolution that there will be citizen-led, without guns, people who conduct traffic stops and so forth. And so, one sees those advancements, and that's real to acknowledge because that's real work on the ground. Yet, at the same time, it's chilling to see the spate of videos of Black people being gunned down, both in present, Black and brown, being gunned down in present, and also seeing video now released from a year ago, video now released from 2 years ago. And with those video releases, inevitably, in virtually every instance, and this happened with Breonna Taylor too, falsified police reports. Falsified police reports that got through other police officers, all falsified, right? And it's shocking to me. It hurts to the core to understand that these things still exist when in fact they don't happen to other people. This is the thing, right? I mean, it's not like it's just universal that you have, if you're American of any ethnic background, of any racial background, that these things can happen to you. But we see them disproportionate with Black people being shot in the head, knees on neck, shot in the middle of the night while they're sleeping, it's like all sorts of things. And then on the other hand, which some of your audiences have probably seen, you've probably seen too, just how much police officers are actually trained in de-escalation, except they do that with white people, even with white people who are armed, and who don't get tased, who don't get shot, even after murdering numbers of people, right? There are too many of those videos to count as well. So those are the kinds of things that remain disheartening. So we see progress, and yet at the same time, one wants to see more, that we really need more. We need a nation to engage in the process of healing. And as part of that healing, it requires that we engage with our past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because the past really isn't ever past.
It's not. I mean, it's the way in which Germany was able to engage about its history with the Holocaust, by engaging with the Holocaust. And one of the reasons why education was so central in that space was because in the immediate years following the Holocaust, what was discovered is that there were people who denied it immediately after, right? We're not talking about 20 years after, 30 years after. We're talking just a couple of years after. You're like, that never happened. It didn't happen. What? Jewish people put on trains, taken to gas chambers? Not here. Not in Germany. That didn't happen. And it was an understanding that, look, that is its own corruption. If you don't actually deal with these issues, then they get papered over. And that also then means that we become vulnerable to the repeat of things that are horrific. And that repeat may not be exactly the same. It may manifest in different kinds of ways, in the way that Jim Crow manifested in a way that was different from slavery, but still deeply pernicious when you have groups of people who find it not a problem to string a person in a tree and then torture their body. It's not slavery. That's not great.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly why it's important to acknowledge those histories, because the rippling effects are still obviously very pertinent within people's lives.
They are, and we all suffer from it. You know, it's sort of the idea that it's only Black and brown people who suffer from those histories. No, we all suffer from that because it frames how we think of each other. It frames just how we move forward in the world with stereotypes and stigmas. It frames how people become fearful and triggered by seeing Black and brown people when it's unnecessary to feel triggered. Um,
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, the lingering history has to be dealt with because there are real life consequences. You know, we've been talking about so many things, and law and the justice system being one of those consequences. So I think that this has been such a wonderful conversation. And to conclude, we just wanted to go back to the three words question. So if you could describe some of the most important aspects of your life with 3 words, which would you choose and why? That's a really good question. I know.
Oh my gosh. So let me just, oh goodness. The first one that comes to mind is joy. And then I'll say that the second one is accountability. And then the third I'll say is perseverance. Although, believe me, I've got some other words that I would add in there. But joy, it comes to mind, excuse me, because of an old Black saying which is don't let anybody ever steal your joy. And when I think about what was it that sustained, I mean, how do you sustain in a society that shackles and chains you and doesn't pay you and tells you that you're not a human and tells you you must work until you die for other people to reap the benefit of it? And so much more, right? Like that's just it. Like what keeps your spirit going for the next generation? And I understand the power behind that. Joy is powerful, right? And so I understand that. So we all must sort of practice that level of resilience and resistance, which I think is being joyful. And then accountability, which is something that I saw with my forebears, right? That we have to be responsible and we have to be responsible to and for each other. And when I think about it and I think about my forebears, they were responsible for a country that wasn't yet embracing of them. And this too is something that's lost in history. The ways in which Black and Brown people and also Asian Americans have suffered for our country, have given for our country. And we haven't even level set with thinking about Indigenous people, right? And who have always put spirit forward for everybody to be able to rise up. And that hasn't yet been appreciated. But, I think about accountability. And then finally, perseverance too, which is part of a legacy as well, right? Which is that we don't give up, you don't surrender, you continue on with best spirit, best effort forward. Being indefatigable, I think, is critically important, right? Let's not give up, let's not lose hope, keep our joy, and remain accountable for going forward. So, with that, I thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of this, this beautiful conversation. We learned so much, and we just appreciate you so much for taking so much time out of your personal schedule to talk with us. It was so great.
Well, I appreciate you, and I look forward to our next time having you on my Ms. Magazine show.
Yes,
I would love that.
Yes.
Yeah, we would love it.
I've found some co-hosts right here, so.
Nice.
You're very welcome. Until soon.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you guys for joining us for another episode of The Welcome Table. This has been Sydney
and Tatum,
and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.